So good morning, everyone. We're into the home stretch, and thank you very much for attending this presentation. So this is New York City's audit and retro-commissioning law called Local Law 87 of 2009. And you're getting credits for attendance at this presentation. So in 2009, New York City enacted a law that mandated buildings over 50,000 gross square feet undergo periodic energy audits and implement identified retro-commissioning measures. New York City is a pioneer in implementing energy audit and retro-commissioning statutes of this scale, which also features penalties for noncompliance. So what that means is, if you've heard of the carrot and the stick approach, this is the stick approach. And of course, during this session, we're also going to examine the program, the data derived since its inception, and we're going to talk a little bit about lessons learned from the program, and we'll touch upon some of the city's additional commissioning code requirements. The learning objectives are how we're implementing Local Law 87 in New York City, how Local Law 87 impacts other programs such as Energy Star and LEED, the role that service providers play in conducting energy audits and retro-commissioning for Local Law 87, and some of the new commissioning requirements. So this is a pretty old statistic, but from 2010, the city took a look at the greenhouse gas emissions per capita, and as you can see, New York City we're pretty low. We're down towards the lower side of the scale. But when you take a look at it, you can see that these are international cities, but up at the top of the scale, we can see that the USA, in comparison, New York City is about a third of the total US. So we do have 8 million people, but we thought that maybe we should take a look at, what's causing that. So this is the 5 train. You can get the 5 train pretty close to where I work. And you can see all the people that are heading into it. We do have the 8 million people. So we could see that, like most large cities, we have a pretty good public transportation system. So obviously, transportation really wasn't where our emissions were coming from. So what was it? So as you can guess, it's our building stock. So New York City has about 1 million buildings. That may be actually we may have even surpassed the 1 million by this point. And I was told that everyone loves the pie chart scale of where the building emissions are coming from, so I'm really glad that I included it. But what you can see is that, roughly it does, the emissions really come largely from our buildings. So what did we do about that? So during the Bloomberg administration, they came up with a plan called Plan YC. And Plan YC basically said that we would cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2030. And that is over 2005 baseline data. So they came up with Plan YC, and this is what it looks like. I'm sorry. And you can Google it and you can get it online. But basically, what Plan YC put out there was a suite of local laws that affect buildings. And Plan YC also has other proposals for how to cut greenhouse gas emissions, but these are the 4 that impact buildings. So we have Local Law 84, which is our benchmarking ordinance. So that is for energy and water benchmarking. We have Local Law 85, which is our New York City Energy Conservation Code. We have 87, which is energy audits and retro-commissioning, which is the basis of what we're going to talk about here today. And we also have Local Law 88, which is lighting upgrades and submetering. And 88 doesn't take effect until 2025, but we're in the preparation stages for that at this point, and so are a lot of the building owners that are in New York City. So in New York City, we have the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, and then we also have different agencies. So the Mayor's Office of Sustainability has responsibility for the policy development, whereas the Department of Buildings is really the agency that has responsibility for implementing and for enforcement. So failure to comply with Local Law 87 in the first year will result in a $3,000 violation, and for each successive year, it's $5,000. So over the course of the 10 years, because buildings are required to comply once every 10 years, that will add up to $48,000, which is roughly, for some of these larger buildings, the cost of doing an energy audit and retrocommissioning. So what is Local Law 87 of 2009? So it's energy audits and retrocommissioning of base building systems in covered buildings. And this is what the law looks like if you were to see it in print. So let's talk about what's a base building system and what's a covered building. So base building systems are outlined in the law, and they refer to HVAC, electrical and lighting, domestic hot water, the building envelope, and conveying systems, your elevators and escalators. So what's a covered building? So a covered building is a single building on a lot that is over 50,000 square feet, and that's the building, not the lot. Or two or more buildings on the same tax lot, and those two buildings together are over 100,000 square feet. So if you have a building that's 65,000 square feet and another building that's 40,000 square feet on the same lot, it's not just the building that's over 50,000 square feet that has to comply. Both of them together have to comply. Or you can have two or more buildings held in condominium ownership that together are over 100,000 square feet. And so how do people know when they're supposed to comply? So interestingly enough, what they did is they chose the building's tax block number. So if the last digit of your tax block number ends in a 9, you're due to comply in 2019. So the law was acted in 2009, and the first compliance schedule began in 2013. And roughly, it's distributed over the 10 years to about 10% per year. So the block number was actually a good distribution in terms of how many we could expect per year. So to give you an idea of what this is in numbers, we have about 23,000 buildings that are over 50,000 square feet. That translates to about 13,000 of what we call BBLs, borough block and lots. So some of the buildings are combined into one submission. So we expect about 13,000 submissions over the course of 10 years. And so each year we have roughly about 1,300 submissions that we expect. So building owners can achieve compliance by first hiring a professional to help them. The owners hire the professional who submits for them an energy efficiency report. Now, this isn't the same report that you would prepare for your client. This is actually 2 professional statements where you would indicate what your certification is and that you are certified to do this work for New York City, and then also a workbook that goes along with it. So there's 2 certifications, one for the energy audit portion and one for the retrocommissioning portion, and then there are 2 Excel workbooks. So the Excel workbooks are really what extracts the pertinent information from the report that would be delivered to the client. So they're really snippets of data that we can compile. So that's what gets submitted to the city, and once that submission is achieved, and we receive it, we mark it as received and compliant, and then we review it, and then if you're chosen for an audit purpose, we will perform a comprehensive review on a portion of those submissions that we receive. So if you attended Jim Kelsey's presentation yesterday, you might have heard about the building sync model. New for 2018, there will be a voluntary use of a cloud-based platform called Building Sync that we've been working with PNNL on for the last year or so, and that will be something that service providers can choose to use this year to comply with Local Law 87 for the energy audit portion. And there are plans in effect for coming up with a retro-commissioning side of that as well. So who can do this work? So basically, you need to be a New York State registered design professional. We've gotten submissions from PEs from Nevada, from Hawaii, but you need to be a New York State professional, so either a PE or a registered architect. But in addition to that, you also have to have requisite credentials. So we heard a lot about how important the credentials are, and so these are the credentials that we have approved for use for submittal to New York City's Local Law 87. So for the energy audit portion, it's the CEM or the CEA from AEE, the HPBD from ASHRAE, BAP from ASHRAE, or the MFBA from BPI, only if you're doing multifamily buildings. And that's for the energy audits. And for retro-commissioning, it's the CB or EBCP from AEE, the CCP from BCA, and now this year and the last year we had, we revised the rule for Local Law 87 to include BCXP from ASHRAE and the CXA from ABC Commissioning Group. So there are exceptions to who has to comply for Local Law 87. Initially, there was only one exception, which was that Class 1 properties. And the Class 1 properties are basically 1, 2, or 3 family dwellings, and they're not required to comply. So usually they will come off the covered buildings list, which is prepared by our Department of Finance, and they won't be on there, but occasionally you may find one on the list. So that's an exception. Those types of properties don't have to comply. Recently, we've had a lot of questions about a section of the law that wasn't quite clear regarding new buildings. So there was a section that talked about if you have a building that's less than 10 years old or that's undergone substantial rehabilitation in the last 10 years, that you would be excused from complying with Local Law 87. And it was written in a way that was very confusing. Very recently, we came up with, in August of last year, the Buildings Department issued a service update that said that basically new buildings with a new certificate of occupancy or a first temporary certificate of occupancy that was within the 10 years of their compliance date would not have to comply. So potentially you can have new buildings that will not have to comply with Local Law 87 for a maximum of 20 years. But we have been reviewing energy code in our plan examination, so we're at a point where, you know, these new buildings, they've all gone through plan review, they're meeting the energy code, so we're pretty confident that, you know, those buildings are going to perform the way that they should. So in terms of the learning objectives of how the Energy Star or LEED fit into it, there are certain properties that do not have to conduct the energy audit portion of Local Law 87. So if the building has received an EPA Energy Star label for at least 2 of the 3 years preceding their filing or their compliance due date for LL 87, they don't have to do the energy audit portion. They still have to do the retro-commissioning portion. If they've received LEED certification within 4 years prior to the filing, they don't have to do the energy audit portion. And then we have another criteria called a simple building. So the simple building is basically no central cooling system, and there are 7 items that are outlined in the law that have to be met in order to be exempt. So basically, it's like front-loading washing machines. It's a whole different set of criteria, and those are meant for the smaller walk-up buildings. And then you don't have to do the retro-commissioning for Local Law 87 if you've received the LEED certification with 2 years and you have the commissioning credits. So what are our service providers actually facing when they go out to do retrocommissioning and energy audits in New York City. So this is one of my favorite pictures. We had given a presentation at GlobalCon a while ago, and someone sent me this like the night before. And basically this is an entry to a boiler room, and these are 4 pit bulls. So it's some of the things we face in New York City that, you just can't make this stuff up. So some of the other obstacles that they face, it's very complicated legislation. I think the first month on the job, I read the law every day, and I was convinced that someone had changed it overnight, because when I came in, I was certain that I didn't remember reading that the day before. I mean, it's a complicated legislation, and there are a lot of exceptions, basically because of point number 3, which is New York City's complex and varied building stock. I mean, we have several 100,000 square foot Class A office buildings, and then we have 50,000 square feet rent-controlled multifamily buildings. So we have a very varied building stock, and you have to really accommodate for the differences in their characteristics and what their performance is and what their utilization is. So with those exceptions, they aren't really well understood. So that was like the one I talked about with the less than 10 years exception. There are a lot of things that we really needed to sort of communicate a little bit better than even our rule could do for the law. So the other thing is it's complicated subject matter. So I still have, building owners who call me and will say, oh, so I have to fill out a form. So where's this form? And, they don't really understand that it's not just a form that you fill out. It's, the hiring of a professional. It's a 12 to 18 month exercise, which is not something they really understand. They don't understand that there's certain testing that has to be done in the heating season or the cooling season. So by the time they realize that they need to do this, which is usually after they get their first violation, they've missed the first portion of the cooling season, the heating season, and then they're into the later part of the year where they've now missed the point where they can apply for an extension. So it's a complicated law, and it's not very well understood. So people, have a little bit of a hard time with it. They don't understand, the ASHRAE Level 2 audit. If, a lot of the presentations I attended yesterday were talking about this, that people don't really understand what the difference between a Phase 1 or a Phase 2, an ASHRAE Level 2 audit is. They don't understand what retrocommissioning is. It's difficult to explain. People, who haven't done this don't really understand what it is. And then balancing. We have a lot of steam systems in New York City, and we struggle with, the balancing aspect of, our steam systems. So some of the other things that, the obstacles that we face with service providers and that service providers face is that it's really new. So when it was first introduced, people thought, oh, this is a great business opportunity. And, we had people hanging out their shingle to do this work that really just didn't understand the complexity of it and weren't qualified to do it. So, we have to deal with going through reviewing applications and projects that, aren't really giving a benefit to the client and aren't meeting the compliance of the law. There's also a learning curve for reporting to a regulatory authority as opposed to reporting to a client. So that's a hurdle that a lot of service providers have to overcome, and it becomes problematic for them in terms of the market and whether it makes sense for them to do this work. So we're always working to try to increase the level of professionalism among the service providers so that we can get a consistent product. And that goes right in line with the quality and the cost. Some of the common errors that we see, administrative errors on the forms, we see a lot of that. Misunderstanding of the legal language, we talked about that. Again, general unfamiliarity with how a proper ASHRAE Level 2 audit is performed. With Local Law 87, again, it's on the base building systems, so people they don't understand that you're not going into a tenant's apartment and looking at whether they have, what kind of appliances they have. It's on the base building systems. They don't understand why they have to include the energy use breakdown, has to include the usage by the tenant components, but yet they don't have authority to change anything in the tenant's spaces. It's a little bit difficult to understand, and we get it, and we're working on constantly improving and constantly trying to explain why we need that data and why it's important to us. Again, lack of retrocommissioning knowledge, and lack of the understanding that it's not just about going into the facility and figuring out what needs to be changed, but actually making those changes. So you'll have a service provider come in to a relatively large facility with hundreds of stream traps, and it's October, and they have to change all these steam traps, and there's just no way that they're going to get this done by the end of December. So it's really a lack of understanding that it's not just identifying what needs to be done, but on the retrocommissioning side, it's actually implementing those changes and correcting those deficiencies. One of the things we have is a resistance to document generally accepted practices and then produce them when requested. So we'll have people say, well, I've been doing this for 30 years. I know, that this piece of equipment has passed this, performance test, and it, really hasn't, because you have nothing to document it. So, you can be holding that royal flush, but the dealer is not going to pay you unless you put those cards down and you show them, right? So for us, we're asking for the documentation, where are your functional performance test data sheets? Where are they? If we don't see them, how do we know that you adequately performed this test when you performed this test? So we have a little bit of a challenge with, not just the people on the side that don't know enough about how to do this, but also the people who really know how to do it but don't want to produce the documentation to show you that they have indeed performed it. Almost a little bit like they're insulted by the question, but we need to ask. We're a regulatory authority, and so it's important for us to make sure that everyone has to produce the same documentation. Lack of design documents, it's more of a challenge that the service providers face rather than an error that we see, but it's very commonplace. We have a lot of older buildings, and even the newer buildings, to get adequate as-built drawings, it's difficult. And one of the most important is a lack of defined current facility requirements. So they will go in and they'll tell us that their readings are fine, but yet they have nothing to compare it to. They're pointing to no standard, to no reference. So how do you know? How do you know that your system is performing well? You need some kind of reference to point to that says, for this type of space or this piece of equipment, this is what's acceptable. So we're kind of busy into our fifth year of, this is now our sixth year of accepting these reports, so we don't get a whole lot of time to do some analysis on where we're at in terms of compliance, but it was really good when I was preparing this presentation and I went to look at some of our statistics, and what you can see is that in general, people started complying in 2013. We've gotten submissions through 2017. In general, what you notice is that you have anywhere from a 54 to 60% compliance rate in the first year, which from what I'm told for new programs is pretty standard, and we should be happy with that. But the really interesting thing that you see is that you can see on right here, this 60% was submissions that came in 2016, and then this additional 1% came in 2017. So the very next year, they had an additional 1%. But then when you look back over the years, the year before, in 2015, initially, in 2015, those submissions that were due in 2015 were about 54% compliance. But within 2 years after that, you went up by about 19%. So when you look back at the first year of compliance, those buildings that had to comply in 2013, you started with about a 56% compliance, and then over the next 4 years, you had 28% more coming in, which leaves you at about an 84% compliance rate within the first 5 years of the program, which is actually pretty good if you think about it for a program that monetarily is not inexpensive to enact. So you can see that, is it the stick approach? By that time, these people could have had upward of maybe $18,000 worth of violations. So maybe, or maybe they just, want to comply with the law. So I was very encouraged by this slide because it does show that over time we are getting pretty good compliance. So what happened along the way between the implementation of these Greener Greater Buildings Plan and now? So you had an article by Scientific American that's shown here that says that cities will lead and not nations. And here's a picture of our new mayor, Mayor de Blasio, with Al Gore and Ban Ki-moon. And so when our new administration came in, they said, we will see your Plan YC, and we will raise you to a one city built to last plan, which now says that we are going to meet 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So in 2050, I'm hoping to still be alive, but I'm hoping not to be working anymore. But we now have a new plan. So you can see both of these plans online. You can look at the Plan YC, and you can look at the One City Built to Last. And One City Built to Last really has a lot more resiliency items in it. And that's because in New York City, we went through Hurricane Sandy, which was, a monumental event for us, and also, has had an impact on our compliance rates because you have facilities like nursing homes that are still on temporary boilers since, Hurricane Sandy. So it really impacted our city, and, we're working towards mitigating some of these climate change effects with our energy initiatives. So what happened next? There are new commissioning requirements in the code. So we talked a little bit about the retro commissioning, and now we're going to talk about the new commissioning items. So the new commissioning requirements first appeared in 2014, and we adopted them in our 2015 on January 1st of 2015 system commissioning. And since that time, we now have a new code, New York City Energy Compliance Code for 2016, which is based on the ASHRAE 90.1 2013. And for system commissioning, it applies to a total mechanical capacity of greater than 480,000 BTUs per hour for cooling and 600,000 BTUs per hour for combined surface water and space heating. In addition to that, it also includes renewable energy systems generating greater than 25 kilowatts and energy storage systems. So those are new items. So prior to approval, what we require is the development of a commissioning plan, including the commissioning requirements in the construction documents, and identifying the commissioning requirements on the TR8 form. So the TR8 form, for us, TR8 is the form where you check off what the mandatory inspections that need to be completed are. So we have independent inspectors that go out there called TR8 inspectors, and they have to be a registered design professional, and they have to be independent. They're usually hired by the owner. Sometimes the architect will hire them, or they'll advise the owner on, how to hire a TR8 inspector. But that's an independent third party that comes out and performs these inspections, and they act as sort of, a help to our inspectors in terms of meeting the requirements of the code. So we also require that these statements are put on the drawings themselves. So you have to have a professional statement about compliance with the code. And you also have to have a statement about whether or not commissioning is required. So we have forms that you fill out and you note whether commissioning is required, but you also have to have it on the drawing, so when the plan examiners look at your submission, your application, they will know whether they have to check for their commissioning requirements. So prior to approval, we have professional statements, and these are some of the notes that have to be on the drawings. And then you have to submit a preliminary commissioning report to the owner, and the department requires that we be sent a letter that certifies that the building owner has received the preliminary commissioning report. And it has to include the tab, the functional performance testing, and the operations and maintenance manuals. And that's a required item actually in our system. So if you don't meet that, you're not going to be on your way to your C of O. So at the end of the process, when you come back to do your seasonal testing and any other follow-up testing that's required, you would complete and submit the final commissioning report to the owner, and you have to make a certification to the Department of Buildings that says that that has been done and all commissioning has been completed. So for smaller buildings, it's within 18 months of the certificate of occupancy, and for larger buildings over 500,000 square feet, it is within 30 months. And there are exceptions. You can request an extension for extenuating circumstances, and we will review that. And the DOB rule is in development, so for every time we have a code or a rule, a law change, what we do is we produce a rule. It's part of the rules of the City of New York. So we are putting a rule together for commissioning. We have a commissioning subcommittee that was convened to debate what the requirements for commissioning would be. And some of the questions that would be answered were, what kind of forms are we going to require for commissioning? What kind of credentials are we going to require? Very important, discussed a lot over the last day or so during the conference. And again, what are the penalties and enforcement measures? So what happens to people if they don't do commissioning? What is going to be the penalty? And lastly, now what? In 2019, there will be a new energy code. They're coming fast and furious now, every 3 years or sometimes more. But we're expecting one in late 2019 or early 2020. And it will be a stretch code adoption. So it'll apply to most commercial buildings, and it will include envelope commissioning. So that's one of the things I guess I would like to see in the next conference is some discussion on some envelope commissioning measures. And it's expected to be 20% better than the 2018 International Code, or actually 90.1 from 2016. So thank you. I'll leave it open to some questions if you have. Mm-hmm.
61st or the 65th floors
Mm-hmm.
of an existing building.
So are you speaking about the retro commissioning, or are you speaking about the new commissioning requirement?
Because I think it's a new fit out.
Mm-hmm.
And the tenant would have higher fees for the commissioning portion of it.
Mm-hmm.
Does that still fall under this law?
Yeah, so generally, people when they, so the question is about tenant fit out, large tenant fit outs in larger buildings in terms of how the new commissioning requirements fit into that. So with the way that the applications for New York City works at the Department of Buildings is you either apply for a new building application or an alteration application. So the larger applications, the larger alterations are usually termed an alteration type 1. So depending on the square footage for that, the commissioning requirements would kick in. But I mean, when the rule is published, there will be, portions of the rule that will discuss in detail that criteria. Yes.
Is your window wall testing just going to be on new buildings? You're not going to go back with the existing ones, right?
For the commissioning?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just new building. Yeah. The system commissioning and envelope commissioning will be on only on the new buildings.
So your greenhouse gas reductions apparently are aimed at the end users. Is that to reduce the utility demand? And are you looking at utility plants to reduce that as well?
There are other means for attaining our greenhouse gas emissions, but I'm talking about the ones that are specifically related to buildings and to this suite of local laws. So the retro commissioning of the existing buildings, benchmarking of energy and water usage, and lighting upgrades and submetering, and the energy code.
Is NYCECC shares a post with the owner or any other organization for that?
For local law 87, does NYCERDA share the cost? They used to. They discontinued that program. So now you'll see on our new certifications, the NYCERDA Flex Test contractor is not included any longer.
One more question is, my understanding that commissioning is required for any existing project over 40 ton or 50 ton heat, still require commissioning, right? Even if it's existing.
In an existing building,
So I'm leaving 50 ton or just 50 ton would still require higher commissioning.
so for an existing building, and you're talking about an alteration where you have a new installation, then you would file the new commissioning requirements. It's just because it's an existing building, if you're impacting the systems, then it becomes an alteration and it goes through energy code review. Okay, so local law 87 is different. It's for existing buildings and it's for retro commissioning. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming.